And ... You're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gravity Max live stream. Today, I am joined by my co-host, Sebastian. How are you doing today?
I'm doing quite alright. It was a very sad day yesterday because I felt the first cold wind signifying
Oof.
that fall is coming. It was disheartening, to say the least. I am a big fan of the warmer months, the warmer seasons, and that was just like a handwritten letter to me saying good times are over. So, how are you
You see,
doing, Max?
I'm doing all right. It's funny because that is sort of the opposite for me. Like when I get
Mm.
those cold gusts here, I'm like, finally, because I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
dehydrated and just like on the ground, just like water. And then you get that cold wind, and it's like, nice. Um,
Fair enough.
but yeah, so yeah, that's just about happened a couple times this week too. So it's like it's funny. But anyway, yeah. So today we are talking about a historical event or series of events, and so yeah, and one of them was very similar to the concept of dibs, which is you'll see in a second. So
Right.
first of all, visit the Gravity Max website at gravitymaxmedia.com. We have cool stuff there, book previews for my books, and news articles, and just it's also like a hub to everything else. So check out that website. Also, follow Gravity Max on your favorite social media platforms: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and Patreon. Links to everything in the description below. Also, follow Sebastian on social media, Instagram and YouTube, 128 seconds. On YouTube, he makes short educational videos that are 128 seconds long, and they are the shorter counterparts to our longer live streams. So check that out in the
Whoa.
description. Make sure to describe.
Hold on one
Describe.
second.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
It just the visual on
Oh, the visual.
the
There's a
thing
problem.
just dropped off
Hmm.
for no
Um.
particular reason. I can't see it anymore. So that means that the people at home probably can't see it.
Hmm.
Here, let me.
Yeah. Stand by.
Stand by, everyone. Sorry
Stand
about
by.
that.
Um.
It just totally dropped off. I don't know what is going on with this business.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Live streaming is difficult.
Live streaming is difficult. Give me 1 second. Sorry.
No worries.
I really don't know why that dropped off.
Hmm.
Alright. Alright. We are back.
All right.
I just gotta
Nice.
readjust it, slide it into position,
Cool.
fix our cameras. This is you see, this is what goes on behind the scenes, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Uh Alright.
All right.
I think we're good. I really don't know what happened there.
Nice. No worries. I mean, I'm just glad that you're doing all the live streaming stuff. I just have to hit one button. So, um, yeah. So anyway, check out Sebastian's channel. Yeah, and go subscribe, not describe, as I said earlier. I'm tired.
Oh no.
Um, I'm always
What
tired.
have you done, Max? Everyone's gonna describe.
Yeah, exactly. They're gonna describe
They're
your
gonna
channel,
describe.
just like 128 seconds. It's a YouTube channel that makes videos about.
Oh my
Um,
god.
yeah, make sure to like and describe. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, check that out.
In any case.
Links in the description below.
Check out
Uh,
ASOS.
Oh yes, yeah, ASOS, a somewhat odd start. now on Amazon. Third book in my science fiction trilogy about space, people living in space, and just crazy things happening in the solar system. Just a lot of uh, interesting events, I would say. Future history. It's fun. I very much am proud of these novels. I think they've come out really well. And yeah, because I've been rereading this book, Red Mars, which was, I would say, the main inspiration for me to write my first book. So yeah, I'm just feeling good about writing right now. So yeah, go check those out.
Nice, man.
Yeah. So, Dibs.
I gotta hit present and present again.
Oh yes.
Because the title
Oh
is
yeah.
again.
The title is close parentheses, open parentheses.
Yeah. Dibs. And Dibs is not to make light of this, by the way, because there were a lot of tragedies that occurred during this time period that we're going to talk about, or as a result of this time period. But kind of like how Dibs the game is ridiculous and contrived. Like if someone, actually like owns something and is eating, like, let's say a bag of chips or something, even though they own and they bought that bag of chips, if you call dibs on that bag of chips, they're gonna be like, no, these are my chips. But you're like, hey, I called dibs, and then you try and take it by force. Anyways, this is about the scramble for Africa. We are not making light of it, but it's just...
Yeah, this is a reference specifically to the Berlin Conference, which we will talk about later in this episode after a bit of historical context. But during the Berlin Conference, the various nations of Europe pretty much just arbitrarily decided like which parts of Africa each country would colonize. And that is sort of akin to the Dibs process of just like, oh, I want this part. I want this part.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's sort of what we're pointing out there. So, yeah.
But, yeah, so Scramble for Africa, this was one of the main things that I remembered from, I think, freshman year of, in which we were in the same class for, history.
Global themes, which no one knows what that actually means outside of our one school. Like, no, what does global themes mean as a class? It's caused me grief because I've gone to at my other school now. They're like, and now I'm doing transcripts for colleges, and they're like, "What does global themes mean?" And I'm like, "Oh, geez. Why do they have to call it that?"
It's basically just history.
I digress. Yeah.
So I remember us learning about this, but we did a lot more research. Pretty fascinating in that it is definitely a landmark. Because like colonization and the transition between old colonization and new colonization occurs because of the Berlin Conference, and the result is the Scramble for Africa, which is new colonization. So it's interesting to see that shift because it coincides with a lot of other things that we've talked about here, like the Industrial Revolution, different interactions between countries, foreign relations, a lot of stuff like that all lined up to make this happen, and it's very representative of what was going on at that point in time. So definitely a very interesting historical subject to talk about.
Yeah.
But without further ado, we go off to old imperialism. I realized that I forgot to include the dates, like the time span of old imperialism. And maybe old imperialism, so 11th century
it's hard to start to give a start date. Because Europe and Africa are right next to each other. And I mean, you could even like, as a stretch of European colonization in Africa, you could even say like the ancient Greeks, because they set colonies on the northern coast. You know what I mean, like with the Mediterranean. Or you could say Rome, which had like also the northern coast, but like It's like kind of like a weaselly argument, right?
Right.
Because that's a whole continent, but it sort of ramped up, and then eventually, once the Berlin Conference occurred, it shifted. You had a lot of early explorers that not only did they go to the Americas, but a lot of the early European explorers actually went around Africa in order to get their route to Asia. That was the first route to Asia before then Columbus went off to try and get the alternate route to Asia, but his math was off, and so he ended up in like the Caribbean. But yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about a couple of things that occurred with old imperialism or old colonization, and specifically in relation to Africa, because Africa was getting colonized and was facing imperialism from Europe far before the Berlin Conference. Like you said, you could point to like Greece or Rome, but it's important to keep in mind the Berlin Conference happened in 1884. Far before that, in 1870, Europe already controlled 10% of Africa. Obviously, that went up exponentially as a result of the Berlin Conference. I think by the end of the 1800s, they controlled 90% of Africa. But it's still important to realize that all of this stuff was like happening before the Berlin Conference, which is why we included this segment. But yeah, so we go over to one of the main motivators that people were imperializing, specifically Africa, was slavery. There were for example, the Triangle Trade Route between Africa, America, and Europe, as well as just explorers and imperialists taking slaves for themselves from Africa. It was the old world. Slaves were seen as a very valuable resource. I'm doing a lot of summer work right now because I left it to the last minute for AP U.S. history, so this is coming up all over the place, and especially for America, which had relations specifically with Liberia, which is why Liberia ended up being one of the countries that actually wasn't colonized by Europe, because they had a lot of relations with America at this point in time. But slaves were seen as a very valuable resource, and it's obviously very, like, there's no words for like how horrible this is. Like, this is arguably the worst thing in American history. Definitely that's most likely the case for a lot of other countries, especially in Europe. But a lot of the powers in Europe had major imports of slaves from Africa, just to to be owned by the Europeans to help them with whatever they saw fit. Again, very unfortunate fact of history. Again, calling it like unfortunate, even calling it like horrible, doesn't even come close to the level of human suffering that slavery was. And human suffering is going to be a big, just reoccurring theme in this episode.
Yeah, this is not going to be a very upbeat episode.
Not a knee slapper. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess another sort of interesting point to take note of is that this is sort of obviously occurring parallel to, like, in the same time period as the colonization of North and South America, but the colonization of Africa specifically during this time period was very different than from North America and South America, where especially England in North America, they were trying to like export population and actually get people to live there permanently. The colonization in Africa during this time period was mostly like forts. So you would get a couple of forts on the coast of Africa, particularly like Central Africa, um, the western coast of Central Africa, you'd get a ton of small forts that were staffed by as few people as necessary. And what they would do is that is where they would sort of like hire out, like they would sort of pit the African tribes against each other to conduct slave raids and then bring them to the forts at the coast where they would be sent to North and South America. But Europeans really didn't want to live in Africa during this time period. They much more would prefer to live in America, North and South America, or just in Europe. And the reason for that is something we'll get to on the next slide. But, well, one of the reasons. It was sort of inhospitable. But unless you have anything more to say here on this slide, just...
any reason for imperialism, it usually boils down to like two main motivating factors, and that's resources and land. And those are kind of go hand in hand, but land also plays into political power to some degree. There's also the will to spread religion, which did happen throughout Africa as a result of the colonization. But this is that first reason I said, resources. Again, unfortunately, slaves and enslaved people were seen as property and as resources, and seen as a very valuable resource. And exactly what you outlined, they would, pit them against each other, steal them, all that kind of stuff. So, just not a great scenario. And again, that's not doing it anywhere near the justice to this injustice, but it was a very large motivating factor for old imperialism into Africa. And the focus did shift in new imperialism, which we'll see, to more like actual what we would think today as resources. But yeah.
Yeah. All right.
We go on
next
over to
slide here. We have malaria. And so malaria, as well as other diseases and factors, was something that made Africa a very inhospitable place to Europeans. And still today, much of rural Africa is very inhospitable. And that's just because malaria is isolated in hotter regions. It's carried by mosquitoes. So Europeans didn't have much immunity to malaria. And so this is actually interesting because it's sort of a reverse of what happened in the Americas, where the Native Americans didn't have immunity to smallpox from Europe. The Europeans in Africa didn't have immunity to African malaria. And so the result of that is that if you, like, they tried to make some colonization efforts into the, central equatorial zones of Africa, but they quickly ended in failure because all of the colonists would get sick with malaria and die. And so that really kept them out for a very long time because we did not have a cure for malaria. And so the native Africans were more immune to malaria just naturally. But then, and now this is a lot of what made the colonization of Africa easier, was sort of the Industrial Revolution. And we'll get to that. But basically, with the Industrial Revolution came things like quinine, which is the treatment for malaria. So if you get sick with malaria, you can be treated with quinine, and that makes it such that going into Africa isn't as deadly for the Europeans. But there are also other effects of the Industrial Revolution, like the mass production of guns, weapons, made it much easier to have a military advantage in these places. And then just like mass manufacturing of other things like barbed wire, I think even like mosquito nets, which would be another counter to malaria, just makes it more hospitable in these central regions. But before before that technology was developed, the colonization in Africa was mostly kept into just the very North Africa and the very south of Africa. So because those areas are farther from the equator, their climate is more temperate. You don't get as much of the malarial mosquitoes. And so, yeah, otherwise it was just small forts until the Industrial Revolution made it more feasible to enter those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you say the name of the drug again?
It's called quinine.
Quinine. I always thought it was like quinine or quinine.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I might be pronouncing it wrong. Let's look it up.
Yeah.
Quinine.
I think quinine is right. It sounds right.
Google dictionary lady says quinine, but I don't think I don't think that's how it's pronounced. I don't think it's pronounced like Janine, but with a Q. That doesn't really. All right, let's see. I'll look it up. Okay, this one I feel like is going to say. Yeah, okay, this one says quinine. That's the American pronunciation.
I'll go with quinine.
Okay. The quinine is the British pronunciation.
British, yeah, that's what I thought.
So, yeah.
So quinine was developed in 1820. So, about 64 years before the Berlin Conference, but definitely because it wasn't developed up until that point, and if we're defining old imperialism as starting maybe somewhere in the 11th century, then yeah, for quite a long time, Central Africa and Western Africa was unable to be imperialized. On the left is a map of the density of malaria cases. For some reason, like, this was a bigger table, but for some reason, from 1955 to 1994, malaria charts were, like, just better resolution. But it went all the way back to the start of imperialism, of new imperialism in Africa, like 1880s. And that trend that you see there it's like the same thing. It's just Western Africa all the way down to, like, Central Africa. But, yeah, quinine, not developed until 1820, so that was really I guess, kind of opened the floodgates to Central Africa, although all that stuff wouldn't really be imperialized until after the Berlin Conference, which we'll see.
It's just the accumulation of technology over the 1800s, I would say, that sort of caused it to, like, reach a critical mass of, like, is it profitable or not? Like, will it increase a nation's power or become a quagmire, essentially, where you sort of hit that limit? Because again, like, before the 1800s, to make, like, Europe still had, like, guns, but, like, to make a gun, it would be like, all right, you have, like, a artisan, is going like, okay, so we have to, like, hammer out the metal, we got to, like, form the wood, everything has to be, like, handcrafted individually. But then, of course, Industrial Revolution, you get assembly line production. I think it was Eli Whitney actually made one of the first, like, guns that had interchangeable parts. And in classic, like, inventor of deadly things fashion, he thought, oh, it'll make war too deadly to fight. I think anyone, this is a PSA, anyone right now that has that thought, this invention will make war too deadly to just stop, because that has never worked in history. That exact thing has happened, like, multiple times. It's almost comedic, if, like, other than the fact that it causes deadly wars. But, like, the inventor of the Maxim gun, also the first machine gun, was like, oh, this will make war too deadly to fight. And it's like, okay, all right, sir. It's just like, it's such a weird thing that pops up in history classes frequently that I'm like, how do people keep making this mistake? It's just crazy. But yeah, so that ability, which became streamlined over the 1800s. And then think of like trains. A very popular thing in new imperial times in Britain was to build a railroad from Cape Town to Cairo, which would span the entire continent because Cairo is in Egypt and Cape Town is in South Africa. And so, railroads, another product of the Industrial Revolution. So all these sort of new industrial products made it easier, like enabled European powers to colonize Africa.
Yeah, I think that puts it perfectly. Just the culmination of technology that had been improving was, the build up to new imperialism and the Berlin Conference. And again, we'll get to why the Berlin Conference happened, who was there, like why they decided to go about it in the way they did. But a lot of it was based on the powers realizing that Africa was now profitable, or like Central Africa was now profitable, and they realized that everybody else also realized that. So they were like, all right, let's talk about this. But again, we'll get to that later. So
yeah,
we go on to the Boers.
Yeah, so the Boers. So Boer is a Dutch word for farmer. And so these are Dutch colonists who colonized South Africa like before new imperialism. And so this is like one of the exceptions to the general like rule of old imperial styles, is that the Boers didn't just set up forts, they actually set up towns and lived in South Africa. And the reason they could do that is because, I mean, if you look back at the malaria maps we had before, you see that South Africa is mostly free of malaria. They really don't have as bad malaria, and that's because South Africa is farther from the equator. So it's so south, we're traditionally thinking like north and south because we're in the northern hemisphere, but once you get down to the southern hemisphere, it's so far south that it's actually out of the heat. And so that made it more hospitable for people to settle. And that would be interesting because that would result in later colonists with the new imperialism would fight the Boers. So the British colonists that would come after these early Dutch settlers would end up fighting with them. And that was sort of one of the things that the Berlin Conference would try to avoid, is the fighting between European powers, because they were like, it's sort of like a prisoner's dilemma, where it's like, oh, if you fight with each other, it's going to end up worse for both of you. So the European powers like realized beforehand, oh, if we can just come to an agreement beforehand on how to split up Africa, then we won't fight each other and we'll be able to do it more effectively. So that's sort of that's part of the rationale. But yeah, so the Boers did live in South Africa. And so that's why today South Africa has a language called Afrikaans, which is like sort of Dutch. It's like a alteration of Dutch that the settlers, like it developed among the Boers over hundreds of years. So that's
it started as a dialect of Dutch, and then grew very not very distinct, but distinct enough to be a different language.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are the big factors that that surrounded Africa during the old imperialism age. These would basically set the stage for the Berlin Conference, for new imperialism into Africa. Eventually, as we'll talk about later, England would actually get into a war with the Boers, two of them, pretty sure, for control of South Africa. But again, this is just setting the stage for all of that to occur, and this definitely goes into the the 10% of Africa that was under European control by 1870.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, without further ado, we can go on to what we've been leading up to thus far. The Berlin Conference. So, this is usually marked as the formalization of the Scramble for Africa, as well as around the time that New Imperialism, like the age of New Imperialism started. New Imperialism was kind of defined as being like starting around like 1881 to 1914, and Berlin Conference occurred in 1884. It was mainly called by Otto von Bismarck, who was the ruler of the, I don't know what the actual term is, like chancellor, maybe?
Oh, well,
Empire?
it was strange because he's technically like, I think it's chancellor, but like he was advisor to the king because the like German Empire had a king. And so the chancellor's role was to advise the king. And this is really interesting because Otto von Bismarck sort of plays into preventing World War I from happening for a long time, for as long as it did. And so basically, you had one king, like, I forget, it's like Fredericks and Wilhelms, all right? So it's just a ton of Fredericks and Wilhelms. And so, like, Frederick listens to Otto von Bismarck and his diplomatic advice.
Right.
And then Wilhelm said, screw it, and said, shut up, Otto von Bismarck, I don't want to listen to you. And so I guess the best equivalent, I think, would be to say, like, Secretary of State is Otto von Bismarck, essentially. Like, that's sort of the role, like, in American politics.
Right.
Except a bit more powerful in that capacity as Secretary of State.
Right. So Bismarck is primarily responsible for convening the Berlin Conference, basically because he wanted everyone to play fair. He wanted to establish a set of rules that all the European powers would follow, if they were going to imperialize and colonize Africa, because he recognized that was the direction that people were going in, especially with, I think, Belgium had kind of jumped the gun on the Berlin Conference and already made its way into the Congo. So Otto von Bismarck sees this and sees that technology has come along far enough that Africa is now viable, and basically the entire continent is now, like, quote unquote, on the table for people to imperialize. And all this is just because Africa as a continent was just technologically behind Europe. And there's that whole, guns, germs, and steel stuff, not to reference Jared Diamond. But
yeah. Although that is usually when people say that, it's in reference to the Americas.
The Americas.
And I would say that's just because Europeans didn't have the germ factor. I would say actually Africa was probably, based on what we looked at earlier, was more effective, had like diseases that the Europeans were not immune to. So
I guess it was guns and steel versus germs.
Yeah.
But
essentially, yeah.
Otto von Bismarck wanted to bring everyone together in 1884 and just discuss how they would, go into Africa, because he foresaw war could potentially break out if, let's say Portugal wants a specific area, but then, Austria-Hungary, like, snags it from it. Then war could immediately incite. And von Bismarck sees this, and he's like, okay, so let's set down some rules. Another aspect of it was that there were actually diplomatic discussions held during the Berlin Conference that seek to actually end the slave trade that was occurring. And that's a big part of it because, again, like I said earlier, the focus shifted off of, okay, we're going to colonize and imperialize Africa so that we can get a higher number of slaves, of enslaved people to our country. It now shifted to, hey, let's actually just own this territory so we can reap the benefits of the land. So it shifted from, the resources of that time of slaves and indentured servants to what like we would consider to be resources like oil, gold, diamonds, stuff like that. So he laid down a couple of rules that he wanted everyone to agree on, and they actually did agree on this. More on that later. But the European powers basically just divided up the continent themselves. We'll talk about who is present on on the next slide here. I'll go over here. So we've a political cartoon up of that's supposed to be Otto von Bismarck.
Yeah, you can tell if you exit and then hit present again. I put in a picture of Otto von Bismarck, like a portrait.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, this is Otto von Bismarck with the cake, Afrique.
Yeah.
Or however you say it in German. Or I don't know what language this cartoon is in. Maybe it's not
French.
I don't know. Because Africa sounds like a French thing, but I cannot tell. Who knows? I just know English and Spanish. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, von Bismarck dividing up the cake of Africa. It's pretty. I would say it's pretty accurate. Hit the nail on the head there. There's also that rumor that they actually divided it up on a napkin. I don't think that's actually true, but I've heard that about how the European powers cared so little about the existing cultures of Africa, because you have to think about that. They had no legitimately zero information on where relations between different tribes in Africa, relations between different powers in Africa, where ethnic groups are, where religious groups were. So when they were drawing these lines, sometimes they drew a line straight through a tribe's land. So one half of the tribe might be colonized by Portugal, and the other half of the tribe might be colonized by Germany. And now you have half of this tribe that used to exist as one people speaking Portuguese and one speaking German, two incredibly different languages. And that increased tensions. And I would say the biggest example of that, of the fallout that can have, is the Rwandan genocide. But again, we'll get to that later. But this same thing also happened with India and Pakistan when they divided it up into West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan. They didn't really necessarily care about what tensions they were going to create. They just kind of almost arbitrarily drew borders. And those are
and also the Middle East too, because the Middle East was also colonized, and so those borders are also strange. So all the borders are kind of bad and arbitrary.
And what really sucks is that those are pretty much the same borders that are there today. With some slight exceptions, if you look at a political map of Africa to where each country is located, those territorial lines are pretty identical to the ones that were drawn up, were hypothesized to be drawn up at the Berlin Conference. Because, again, the Berlin Conference, while von Bismarck was laying down rules such as he wanted to ensure that war wouldn't break out between the different powers, so he laid down rules of competition, such as Leopold II of Belgium was actually guaranteed the area along the Congo River. I think that's just because he got there first. As well as no nation was to stake claims in Africa without notifying other powers of its intentions. No territory could be formally claimed prior to being effectively occupied. But, as you might know, or as you might have guessed, the countries didn't really follow these rules. We're going to get to a couple of maps in a little bit showing what each country wanted going into the conference, paralleled by what they actually got. So it really just became a first come first serve. If you are able to get to a country and no one has, or a territory and no one has gotten there yet, you get that territory. So while the sentiments were there of, hey, let's go into Africa and not start a war in Europe, the actual rules were pretty much completely just disregarded. Going with land guarantees, I'm not exactly sure how that really worked out. I don't think there were many land guarantees outside of Leopold II being guaranteed the Congo area. So a country might have had a plan. Many countries wanted the West Africa region, but it was ultimately France that ended up with the lion's share of West Africa, with England getting a few countries in there. But again, that was really just first come first serve. France was able to get to West Africa first, so they got the western coast of Africa. So that was the big reason of why they conferred. It was because Otto von Bismarck didn't want tensions between Europe as they all basically swarmed Africa. Again, that massive jump of 10% control to 90% control. So that was those are the base reasons for the Berlin Conference, and unfortunately they didn't really follow the rules that they had laid down. But if we don't have anything else,
well, it is.
Yeah, go ahead.
It is interesting because they were mostly successful, I would say, in the intentions of not going to war with each other in Africa. So in that sense, the Berlin Conference was successful for its members. And it is just really interesting, just on a individual level, of just Otto von Bismarck as a historical figure. He's sort of an obscure historical figure, but it's kind of interesting because he prevented a lot of wars, with his politics, which is just kind of fascinating. It's strange to think about.
Yeah.
That was his main mission, no wars. And so that's kind of, I don't know. Because I've seen I like to watch alternate history videos. I think they're pretty entertaining. And so a lot of the ones about World War I talk about Otto von Bismarck either living longer or not living longer. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah. So now we go on to who was actually at the Berlin Conference. So we have all the flags up here, and we've separated them into two boxes, and we'll explain what those mean, but just quick list of everyone that was there. And the flags are accurate to the time, so some of them look different to how they look presently. The top left black, white, red one is the German Empire. Looks different than the nation state of Germany that we all know and know today.
Yeah,
and
we all know and know.
Top right in the green box, that is the Kingdom of Portugal. A lot of these are kingdoms that are no longer kingdoms, such as Italy in the middle bottom row in the green box. But and that funky flag, I didn't actually know this until we started doing research. That funky flag, bottom right red box, is Sweden-Norway. Now, Norway and Sweden weren't the same country at any point in time, but I believe they were
Okay.
ruled under the same government at a point in
Is
time.
it the Kalmar Union,
I think I
perchance?
think so. I think it was the fact that they were represented by the same monarchy, and I think that
Hmm.
might have been the Kalmar Union. And that is the flag, which is that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of cool.
Yeah,
Um,
it is cool. It's just it's interesting whenever the Kalmar Union is referenced because like we had a Minecraft server
mm-hmm.
where we were the Kalmar Union, and that was an interesting experience to say the least.
Wow.
We don't need to go into it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
um, so yeah. Anyway,
So
so lots of outdated countries. Also, Austria-Hungary, I should say,
right,
right above the Kalmar Union. Not a country anymore.
right. It has undergone mitosis, and it is now Austria and Hungary.
And a
Um,
ton of others.
yeah, but so going through it, we have the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, Spain, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, the Kingdom of Italy, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Portugal, Russia, Sweden, Norway, and the Ottoman Empire, all attending. That's 14
Hmm.
attendees, or I guess powers attending. Some countries sent more than one delegate. I know Germany had four present, including Otto von Bismarck. But all of the countries in the green box were left the Berlin Conference knowing that they had, you know, free reign to go into Africa and lay down territory. All the countries in the red box were either only at the conference to kind of, hear what was going on, or were there and then ultimately walked away from the conference knowing that they were not going to get any territory in, um, in the scramble for Africa. Also, if you look at the Russian flag, the French flag, and the flag of Netherlands in a sequence, it looks like it's the Russian
Mm.
flag doing like a somersault and falling on its face. I've just noticed that. But
Mm.
in any case, so the U.S., Denmark, Austria, Hungary, the Kalmar, and the Netherlands. Yeah, that's the Netherlands. And the Netherlands all knew that they were not going to be, they were not going to have any stake in Africa in the coming years. But the nine countries in the green box knew that Africa was completely fair game for them.
Mm. So why did the red box countries not get Africa? Like, was because were the rules like universal? Like, if you stake a claim and have like a fort or something, then you get a certain amount of land, or was it like these powers only get to do that?
So I would assume that it was a little different for each country. If we just get started from top to bottom, the U.S., as I said earlier, it had very good relations with Liberia,
Hmm.
namely because the U.S. outlawed slavery or abolished slavery in 1865. So it was Liberia became part of a project in America to return slaves to Africa, now freed slaves to Africa, and they chose Liberia for that. So Liberia was pretty much completely under not U.S. control, but it was such a strong partner of the United States that no European power was going to tread on Liberia. So I imagine
Hmm.
the US was there just for like information purposes, maybe to ensure that the European powers were not treading on Liberia, um, and stuff like that. I would assume for the Scandinavian nations, like Denmark and the Kalmar, uh, I can't really see them actually going into Africa. I don't think their navies were too strong. Their populations were pretty small as well compared to the other
Hmm.
countries on this list. So I imagine they were there pretty much only because they had been involved in previous wars with Europe and because they were just a part of Europe. So I can see why Otto von Bismarck would call them in just to discuss all of this, even if he thought that there wasn't a big chance that they were going to actually try and colonize Africa. He probably thought it important to still invite them, to have a seat at the table, as not to make them feel like excluded or stuff like that. Again, that's a little bit of speculation. I didn't find a lot of stuff on each country's motive to mainly just to attend the conference was up to Otto von Bismarck, who conferred or who convened the meeting. With Austria-Hungary was a little strange because they actually ended up with a part of Africa, but not any land. They actually ended up controlling a bay in Africa, in southern Africa, off the coast of Mozambique, I believe.
So they owned the water?
They owned the water, like the bay itself,
That is
not the land.
That's really strange.
Again, that's probably because it was somehow delegated that Austria-Hungary, and I would assume the Netherlands as well, would not gain any more land territory than, I guess, that they already had, because the Netherlands and the Dutch had set up in South Africa. Austria-Hungary was like, so I will not get the land, but I shall get the water. I guess that was their plan.
Yeah. It's like when the ship docks, 10 feet to the left of that water, Austria-Hungary's just like, no. But they've subverted our plan.
Honestly. But all of the red box nations, it probably just wasn't very, I guess, economically beneficial for them to colonize Africa. Like, for the U.S., at this point in time, the U.S. was still kind of being settled. I don't know how many states we had at this point in time, but I think we were...
Not all of them. It was like 45-ish.
So
it was still like Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona were not yet states in the 1880s. Possibly more. But it is interesting also just that the U.S. was probably more focused on Latin America than Africa. So
yeah, our only concern in Africa was probably Liberia, which is probably all our delegates were doing at the table, was making sure, hey man, Liberia, that's us. It's our boys.
Yeah.
That's why they are, when we look at decolonization of Africa, they are first on that list. It's kind of on a technicality, because colonization is kind of like a strong term for the relation that America had with Liberia, but because of the relation, they were the first nation to be quote unquote decolonized in Africa. And I think that actually might have happened even before the Berlin Conference. The date on their independence, they have two independence dates, one of them being 1847, interestingly enough.
Wow.
And then the other being in 1961. So those probably correspond to different historical events. But the biggest thing about Liberia is its relation to the U.S. And then the other countries in the red box, it was probably, they either just didn't have the means to colonize Africa, or in some other way it just wasn't economically beneficial for them to do so. There was the Triple Alliance had been created at this point, the alliance consisting of the German Empire, the Kingdom of Italy, and Austria-Hungary. So that could have been a motivating factor for Austria-Hungary, because they know that, hey, our boys Germany and Italy are going in there, so we can hang back. We'll get this bay, man. It'll be great. But that is...
It's so weird that they own the water.
Yeah.
But it's interesting though, because if that were to happen today, they would sort of do what China's doing in the South China Sea, You know how they're like making islands out of the
Mhm.
water,
Yeah.
but like back then they couldn't really do that. But that's just an interesting concept of like to own the water around a place. Like that's just so strange. Anyway.
Yeah. So the specific bay is Maputo Bay, um,
Mhm.
which I think actually ended up being owned by Portugal at the end, because Portugal would become the colonizing factor, the colonizing power in Mozambique, um,
Mhm.
and Maputo Bay is in Mozambique. So I guess they must have delegated that out themselves. There wasn't any war um, that occurred because of it. But these 9 nations in the green box would basically be the main players in the scramble for Africa. I don't believe the Ottoman Empire actually got anything in Africa,
Yeah.
but
Um yeah, they didn't really get anything in Africa. And the Ottoman Empire, for anyone that does not know, because that's not a thing that exists anymore, that's like Turkey through Saudi Arabia is the Ottoman Empire.
right. So if we don't have anything else on this, we can pop on over to why did they want to go into Africa? And we've alluded to this a lot.
Mhm.
Um, it was a shift into Africa's natural resources instead of just primarily focusing on slaves and even just crops, because originally it was mainly just slaves and crops that might be able to grow in Africa. But as you can see on this map, and this is like a recent map from like 2016,
Mhm.
not a map from like from their time, but
Yeah,
with
the
the
1880 European powers weren't that interested in uranium.
yeah, that was about to say like
Uh,
uranium and like
um,
platinum maybe to some degree, but
Probably the metals they were interested in.
yeah, exactly.
Um,
And petroleum, like oil, was in use at this point in
mhm.
time. Their methods of obtaining it were probably, get ready for this, crude, but
Oh boy.
um, it was still like it was still known to them. Africa is the planet's second biggest continent, if I'm
Mhm.
remembering correctly. Asia's the biggest. I know that.
Yeah, that
So
sounds right.
I'm gonna guess Africa is the second biggest.
I can't think of another one that's larger. So,
So
yeah.
so Africa, second largest continent. So obviously going to be incredibly rich with resources, and it is. It might be the most resource rich continent on the planet, because it
Mhm.
is it's more like horizontal, or no, it's more vertical than it is horizontal, which means that because it hits so many different like climate zones, that different
Mhm.
crops are going to grow. You can have different flora and fauna, but as well as the geology of it is going to be incredibly varied. Like
Mhm.
you can see like the diamond belt that's going, not really a belt, the diamond tie. I don't know what article of clothing that
Column.
would be. Yeah,
Yeah.
the diamond column there, the
Mhm.
petroleum hat, and like the gold cufflinks that are going on there,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
the phosphate hair clip, but all that stuff is just very telling of how rich Africa was in these natural resources, and of course
Mhm.
the ultimate like sad irony of it is that the the native African people didn't really have the resources to harvest those resources, and that's a very common thing you see in just with like global relations and like stuff in economy trends, when a nation is very heavy into one resource, which is the case in Africa, such as the like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or at the time just the Congo, which is the one in the center that has diamonds and cobalt. Diamonds are its main export, and in current day, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is basically being kind of scammed for its diamonds, to use like layman's terms, because it's its main export, and because it's its, you know, pretty much its biggest and not its sole export, but it's what it relies on to keep the country going to whatever degree it's going at. People are able to, you know, get better prices off of them, make, you know, deals that aren't really fair with them, stuff like that. That's also kind of what happened with Venezuela, because Venezuela was so rich in oil, and oil was its pretty much one thing. It's like oil and like cocaine, so but mainly oil. So that when that fell short, when like there were recessions and like oil wasn't selling as much, the country just, and I mean, you look at it now, and obviously some of that is due to the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro, but it started, I think under the rule of Hugo Chavez, where when recessions hit and oil prices changed, the country kind of goes belly up, because that's its one avenue. That's kind of why the United States is able to get back on its feet whenever there's a global recession. Obviously, the Great Depression hit us extremely hard, but we're able to get back on our feet because we have so many different revenue sources. Like we have, you know,
you have agriculture, oil, manufacturing,
entertainment,
all
that stuff, wood, timber, all that kind of stuff. We were able to kind of like get back on our feet. It's not the case with African countries, unfortunately. But that was the main reason why these powers wanted Africa. They also did serve like other motives while they were in Africa, such as spreading religion, namely Christianity, into some of these countries. You can still see that today. But it was mainly just natural resources, and I guess kind of following in England's footsteps, because that, you know, they saw how powerful the British Empire was, and I mean, like the idea of having a territory is very advantageous to a country if that country can maintain that territory, maintain control of that territory from across, in this case, from across the Mediterranean. So, when the technology falls into place and the Berlin Conference is held and, like, you know, rules are set down, but Africa becomes free game because you have, like, quinine and all that stuff, then it suddenly becomes feasible and it suddenly becomes advantageous to get a territory. And those are the main reasons.
Yeah, and yeah, it is really interesting because like Europe itself, like for lots of history, has been like overpopulated and has like sort of stripped its resources bare, because like people have lived there like for such a long time, and it's like the sort of development, the technological development allows for more like resource collection, and just the climate there just makes it easier to do that kind of thing. And that sort of manifests in like the Black Death when you look at that. And just like it, you know, they've sort of like used up their resources, which is why they had to go like in search of other places to get resources for them. So it's like interesting. And Africa is kind of has the reverse effect, because Africa, especially during this time period, actually had a lot of underpopulation just because of the amount of slaves that were transported to the Americas left Africa itself to have a lower population than it would have had, like to a significant degree. And so that left a lot of the resources unused there. And that's sort of like a strange phenomenon. Like usually the world like sort of reaches its capacity in terms of population and stays around there. But yeah, Africa was underpopulated for a long time.
But yeah, that is the answer to the question: why Africa? That is why Africa. So,
Hmm.
like what we alluded to earlier, I'll hop over to that now. What each power wanted. Um, this is like what they either proposed at the at the Berlin Conference, or based on previous treaties. I put the flags there for each country, so you know. Shout out to forum mapping on Instagram for these maps. I left the watermark in. These these maps show like ideally what they wanted, and then we'll show what they actually got. I would say out of these, it was France and England that got the most of what they wanted. Like obviously, if you look at those two maps, there's crossover. Both Britain and France want, for example, that's Sudan, I believe. Both of them want the Sudan area. Obviously, only one of them, or perhaps another power, can end up with the Sudan area. But Max mentioned this earlier. Britain aimed to create a rail system from Cairo to Cape Town, Cairo being in Egypt, Cape Town in South Africa, and creating a contiguous line of territories all the way across a continent is it's a very economically smart idea, especially for creating like a rail system, because that creates almost like a line of production across a continent, which is...
And it dips into like every single climate zone that Africa has to offer.
Absolutely. If we go back to the resource map, we see that England would be hitting petroleum, gold, copper, tea, nickel, platinum, and diamonds, and stuff like that. So France went the other way, where they kind of went horizontally. Still incredibly large swaths of land, and access to the sea. As you can see, they want what they probably foresaw was creating ports at all of these sides of Africa. So pretty much like a north, west, a southwest, and an east port, which is very economically advantageous in another way, because shipping was getting more and more powerful as ship technology was improving. So in that way, they were being economically smart about where they wanted to stake their claims. And you can see...
Also, this is just after the construction of the Suez Canal, too.
Right.
So it makes it like easier for them to get around.
Yeah. What you can see in France's thing is they actually drew a line around Liberia. I'm pretty sure that's Liberia in the bottom left, or it might be those two divots a little above it. But they knew not to go into Liberia because of the United States.
Yeah, that's Liberia. I think it's Liberia and Sierra Leone. Yeah, that's what it looks like. But yeah.
So, each country wanted different things. Let's talk about Portugal real quick. And that is, I do realize that I put the incorrect flag. That's the current day flag of Portugal. The correct flag of the Kingdom of Portugal was the blue and white flag that I had on the previous slide. So, shame on me. But let's talk about what is happening with Portugal right now.
So this is pretty fascinating, because this goes back to, I think, the 1500s, the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal, which was like in reference to South America. So this treaty was essentially like not deliberate, it was like mediated by the Pope, who said, like, Spain and Portugal, you are both Catholic countries, you should not be fighting over land in South America. And so he said, all right, I'm going to draw a longitude line. Everything east goes to Portugal and everything west goes to Spain. That's why in South America, you have Brazil alone as a Portuguese-speaking country, but then all the countries to the west, or sorry, to the west of Brazil are Spanish-speaking countries because Spain colonized the western half of this continent and Portugal colonized the eastern half. But it seems that maybe not entirely seriously, but like in some respects, Portugal was like, well, technically, we are entitled to all of Africa because Africa is east. The whole thing's east of that line, and it's like, yes, technically, but also, you know, anyone who's not Spain or Portugal or Italy doesn't really care what the Pope has to say. You know what I mean? Like Britain's not going to listen to the Pope. So yeah.
So another point on the Portugal map, it says according the lower section says according to quote unquote the pink map. That was a common theme throughout the Berlin Conference, where different countries had different agendas and different like plans they wanted to present. So the pink map was a project in which the colonies of Angola and Mozambique would be under Portuguese control, but basically the relationship here was between Portugal and Britain, because all of the countries that attended the conference except for Britain actually endorsed Portugal's ambitions in this. They endorsed that, okay, Portugal can take that little belt right there from Angola to Mozambique. So
but Britain's like, no, you're going to cut off my railroad.
Yeah, basically. The British government in 1890 issued an ultimatum that demanded for the Portuguese to withdraw from the disputed area. And we'll see where that, specifically along that line, the disputed area was. Spoiler, it's right in the middle, because that's where they wanted their railroad. But, each other country wanted individual things. I'm pretty sure each country was disappointed because, when you have this many competitors here, the only one not that was in the green box not pictured here was Belgium, because Belgium was like, we're taking the Congo, that's what we're doing, that's our thing, man. Interesting that the French map actually dips into that. Perhaps they were trying to negotiate with Belgium on that. It seems like Germany to some degree as well. Portugal is just going insane, but it was
the Portugal thing. That's like it's. I bet the individual like guy from Portugal who brought that up, because I imagine it's just like one person from Portugal brought that up, was like, it's like when you find like an obscure like old law that no one really cares about anymore.
Yeah.
Because at this point they've lost all of their New World colonies, so the Tordesillas line is kind of irrelevant at this point because all the countries of South America are independent now because of like the revolutions in the early 1800s. So it's like, It's just kind of comical that someone would bring that up. Like, what are you doing? Anyway.
So this is what they wanted. Let's look at what they got. Here's what they got. So the left is the after the Berlin Conference. The right is after the Berlin Conference. The left is before it. So you can see here, like it's more showing off like the different tribal territories, the different regions or like colonies to some degree. But on the right you can see who got what, and so contrasted to what they wanted, it looks like England did the best in following their original design. They almost completed that line.
Yeah.
They almost completed it, but they were stopped by the German Empire taking Tanzania. Um, so that must have been frustrating.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Just the railroad concept. Like, it's sort of like the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad, like
Mhm.
that was a huge boon to like settling the West. So it's interesting that like they were unable to get that for Africa.
Yeah, but France, achieved its goal of hitting that the Western Front. Having access to what looks like three different, well, the Atlantic Ocean is just kind of like one body of
Hmm.
water, but like three different entry points into the into the sea.
Hmm.
So that definitely helped them with like
Yeah,
ports and stuff like that.
and if you also try to like imagine Europe to the north of Africa here, like this map just shows Africa, but like Algeria up at the top here in French territory is like directly south of France itself.
Right.
So that is pretty useful to France.
But yeah, anything else that you see, you can look at the key there. You can see that Belgium was, strictly just in the Congo. Let's see, where is Spain at? Spain got like northwestern Africa, as well as a little bit in Central Africa. Portugal, it seems that its plans were foiled by the United Kingdom, who broke up that line that it wanted
Hmm.
from Angola, that western country, that western splotch of green, to Mozambique, that eastern splotch of green. But it looks like the United Kingdom's plan was foiled itself by
Hmm.
the German Empire.
Yeah, it's all interesting. Um, Although I feel like the two halves of the British territory could actually be connected by that like Rift Lake essentially,
Mm.
and then river systems. Um, because those like long lakes, like those that you see around Tanzania, is actually a tectonic feature of this new fault line, essentially like tearing off the eastern part of
Mm.
Africa, which is just sort of interesting that that's happening. So these rift valleys have filled with water, um, as eventually this region of Africa will become like a giant island, um, which is like, tens of millions of years. Um, but also interesting is that Ethiopia remained an independent nation,
Mm-hmm.
which we'll talk about more later. But I think it was sort of allotted to Italy. So it was like, okay, Italy, you can have Ethiopia. But then Ethiopia said, no, you cannot,
Yeah.
which is rare because usually, like, if you look at the rest of the continent, most of the local like nations were overpowered by the European nations. So Ethiopia was able to fend off Italy, which was like pretty impressive. And then also Liberia is staying independent, but that's like it's like because it's independent, but it's like tied to the U.S. Like if they were doing something the U.S. didn't like, they would not be very independent for long, probably. Um, that's how it tends to work with the U.S. Right? So yeah, then you have a few other like local nations here, but
Um, yeah. So this was the aftermath. As you can see, not every country got what they wanted. Certain countries were interrupted by others. But you can really kind of see how it was like a kind of a gold rush because
hmm,
Britain was no doubt like rushing through all of these territories just trying to claim them. And it's remarkable in what a short amount of time this was completed in because you just look 1880, the only colonized parts of it colonized by an outside source would be South Africa and perhaps Liberia. But then, like, is that like 30 years later? All of this is pretty much colonized by European powers. So you can kind of see how it just became a competition on a global scale with all of this. So there you go. We go on over to new imperialism, if I can figure out how slides work, which is defined as 1881 to 1914. So I believe 1881 was when the Belgians went into the Congo. So I believe that's what kicked it off. The Berlin Conference, falls on the earlier side of that, and the Scramble for Africa is basically all contained within new imperialism. I don't really know what the 1914 end date signifies. It might have something to do with World War One. Yeah. But,
because in World War One, they stopped sending any more resources to colonization because they are preoccupied with other things. Also, they were pretty much done in terms of taking control over things. They had already, by that point, taken control over the whole continent, essentially.
So, this was the age of new imperialism. Imperialism for a different, for a different motive, trying to get actual natural resources in, trying to just gain political power over others. Because a big factor in the Scramble for Africa was that other countries were trying to also get there, Like the disputes between Portugal and England, Germany blocking that rail system that could have been, but all of that was just motivating factors. But just picking out some interesting things from this time period in Africa, we're just going to focus on a couple of things here. There were many just niches, and it's really too large of a topic for us to cover, even if this episode was going to be 5 hours long, which it isn't. Jesus.
Yes.
But
no, we refuse.
But if there is anything you could look up any single country in Africa, and you can get hours upon hours worth of history just based on that country's relation with the Scramble for Africa. Because every single country in Africa was, in some way interacted with, or, the Scramble for Africa had some effect on it besides, like, Liberia. So, you have all of that occurring. So, feel free to research it for yourself. But, to kick off, points of interest in the new imperialism era in Africa is the Belgian Congo, which is the most nightmarish place ever. On the right is King Leopold II, who was the king of Belgium, who basically led the imperialization of the Congo, which became known as the Belgian Congo during this point in time. And on the left, you have a political cartoon titled "In the Rubber Coils," and that is exactly. It's very, very telling of what went on in the Belgian Congo.
Yeah, the Belgian Congo is like notoriously like the. I mean, I don't. It's kind of hard to make evaluations in history about what's the worst, but it's the one that like you hear about the most, definitely, as a notoriously bad example of what happened during this time period in Africa. And also, the name of that cartoon, the Rubber Coils, that was the main resource of the Belgian Congo at this point in time that it was exporting was rubber. So, because now they're, diamonds? So
Mhm.
In the past, it was rubber was the primary resource.
Right. So, um, King Leopold II basically ruled the Congo with an absolutely iron fist. Like, iron fist sounds like almost too slight for really what it was. The penalty for any um, any dissidents, even perceived dissidents, was typically getting a limb severed. And there are pictures out there. If you really want to look at them, go ahead. There's no way we're showing that here, of just
Mm.
piles and piles of human appendages, based on if the the Belgian officials there, if they thought someone was being dissident or someone wasn't working hard enough.
Yeah, often it was just like they had quotas for how much like rubber they had to collect, and if they didn't meet the quota,
Mhm.
then that would be the punishment. So not even like taking up arms against
Right,
the like Belgian authorities, literally just like not meeting the quota.
right.
So,
So yeah, I don't think it's a mistake that the snake in the political cartoon is wrapping around the leg
mhm.
and the arm of that person, because that's typically what would be taken. There are pictures of survivors of the Belgian Congo, and a lot of them are missing an appendage or two, and obviously that's incredibly horrific. Um,
Mm.
the absolute severity of the Belgian Congo might have been because it was the only territory that Belgium held, and Leopold employed the strategy of just consolidation of his attention. Um, I think the strategy here was like not to have like many territories in different places, but just one large one that he could kind of like keep an eye on. Um, so in order to ensure productivity and ensure like profits and that it was economically beneficial for him to hold on to this territory, he established this incredibly authoritarian policy.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and it is strange because Belgium is like a tiny country
yeah, honestly.
that is not very powerful. Literally, there Belgium is so not powerful that it was Germany in World War I and World War II decided we might as well just invade all of Belgium to get to France because that'll be easier than getting through France's main defenses. Like, that is crazy that Belgium had the ability to do all this because they are not like powerful at all.
Yeah. Um, Even though slavery was coming to a close on the global scale or on the global stage at this point in time,
Mhm.
slavery was still rampant in the Belgian Congo. Um, just absolutely forced labor. Like maybe not in law, these people were property, but by all
Mhm.
intents and purposes, these people were forced into labor. So, kind of like by definition, they were slaves.
Yeah, there's a lot of like de facto slavery in here.
Yeah.
Like later we'll get to South Africa, which like the apartheid system was essentially like very nearly slavery. Um,
Right.
like much worse than like the American South uh, during the 1900s, like the Jim Crow system. The apartheid system was like the like more extreme version of that in South Africa. And that didn't get like abolished until the 90s, which is like crazy. Um yeah.
Um, yeah. The the militant force in the Belgian Congo was known as the Force Publique. I think it kind of is like what
Hmm.
looks to be like French spelling, but it's probably not. Uh, uh, what language do they speak in Belgium? Is Belgian a language?
Belgian? Here, I'll look it up. All right, the official languages are Dutch, French, and German.
So
Basically, just the part closer to Netherlands is Dutch, the part closer to France is French.
right.
So they're like Switzerland in that there's not really like a language, it's just whatever they're closer to.
So the force publique
Mm.
officials would literally be encouraged to be violent and inhumane to the workers, to the to the enslaved people that were collecting this rubber, to the point where they would actually get monetary bonuses for bringing their officials the severed hands of workers. Like it became a symbol of the force publique in the Belgian Congo, were these baskets of hands that these soldiers would carry instead of rubber. Sometimes they would go out to just harvest hands instead of rubber, and it's such a horrific thing to think about.
Mm.
This level of just human abuse and cruelty is pretty much matched only by a few other things in history, and this incentivized brutality of these workers is just so apparent. There's also a large amount of re-education that occurred in the Belgian Congo, specifically with children, because children were too young to work. The alternative that was found was sending them to Catholic missionary schools and re-educating them to be Roman Catholic, and barring that, these children would just become soldiers. Child soldiers is a very common practice at this point in time in Africa, and unfortunately still like today. But Belgium utilized this in the Belgian Congo. They would also take hostages if an individual didn't want to work and they had already had their hand cut off, because they would need at least one hand to work, so they would leave you with one hand. They could take your wife hostage or your child hostage, and the conditions of the schools that they sent the children to were horrific. I think it's around 50% of the children that were sent to these schools or to these camps where they trained to be soldiers, around 50% died of disease. So,
Wow.
incredibly horrific conditions, incredibly authoritarian. Again, the cruelty displayed here is really only matched by like the Holocaust, select other instances in history. But the Belgian Congo is definitely very close to the top of the list of just widespread human atrocities that occurred. That's a brief overview of the Belgian Congo. There's a lot more niches with like economic decisions, with other ways in which they kept the Congolese people in line and under their control. The Congo would get its independence. Let me check.
I think it says 1960 on the map.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
So this, so the dates there seem to be correct. Although I think Belgium was in the area before 1908, but they might not have assumed
Probably
full control.
Like wasn't formalized. It probably just like was informal until 1908.
The Belgian Congo was a Belgian colony in Central Africa from 1908 until its independence in 1960. So these atrocities were happening for at least, at least 6 decades, or like 5 decades going by those dates, which is an incredibly long amount of time to be under 1 year under this kind of oppression would be an incredibly long amount of time. So,
Mm.
let alone imagining 52 would be, it's unimaginable. But that's why there are still people walking around in the Democratic Republic of the Congo with their hands missing and stuff, because this ended recently enough that a child in the late 50s who didn't want to work, didn't want to become a child soldier, didn't want to die of disease in a Catholic missionary school, might have had his or her hand severed, and is now walking around, as an adult with that injury. It kind of puts things into perspective. This is not to say that the other colonies and the other territories were just fun places, but there's no question that the Belgian Congo was the worst place to be a native African during this time period. The other colonies, again, were not great by any means. Again, there was still a lot of forced labor, perhaps not like the legal definition of slavery, but still a lot of forced labor, a lot of just a lot of people being disenfranchised. There's still the idea of like racial hierarchies at this point in time. Stuff like that. The like forced spreading of Christianity. The other territories were not, were not objectively good places to be in. But the Belgian Congo is objectively the worst of the worst. So I think we just felt it important to talk about, because again, you often see it referenced, because it's such a horrific display of human depravity, but it's important to understand like what it actually was. And again, we're just doing a brief overview of it, but if you want to do more research on it, check it out. But don't eat before you do that research, because it is horrific.
Yeah.
But I think that's all we have on that. We go into southern Africa, namely South Africa, which, as we said earlier, in the old imperialism era, was colonized by the Boers from the Netherlands. There were two Anglo-Boer wars. The one that is listed here on the cover of this book is actually the second one, in which Britain won, which is why they achieved control over the territory of South Africa. And that's actually what led to South Africa being the first country in Africa to get its independence outside of Liberia, because what came as a result of this war was that Britain had all of these territories that were land-wise they were connected to each other, but they were very disjointed. So in 1909, I believe, they signed an act that just made it, first of all, one territory, as well as granted it effectively independence. But I would say that this was the only European on European war in regards to territory over Africa.
Yeah, and this is what Bismarck was trying to avoid.
Right.
But yeah, it is sort of interesting because the causes of the war are uncertain, it's kind of muddled and confusing. But it's pretty much just over the land conflict. You know, the Boers were farmers, so they owned land, and as the British were sort of starting to colonize in that region, the Boers felt threatened by the British, and so they fought. And the Boers were like severely outnumbered too, because it's not even like the Netherlands anymore. Like it's not part of the Netherlands, so they didn't get support like from the Netherlands army. It was just the Boers that were there fighting against the British army. Um, so
But yeah, so the Second War lasted, as you can see, for 3 years, and the outcome of it was that Britain did achieve victory and achieved control over the area. But South Africa would get its independence just 7 years later in 1909. I would say South Africa is a very, very important territory, just going politically and economically. The aftermath, like the legacy part of South Africa, would be apartheid. The whole racial situation in which Nelson Mandela came to light, the division of whites and blacks in South Africa was institutionalized and mandated by law, until eventually that system fell fairly recently. I don't even hear when did apartheid.
yeah, like 1991,
I was
1994.
gonna say 92. Yeah, apartheid.
Yeah, I mean that is like really like unusual. Like they actually had sort of the yeah in the 80s they had the international like community say like we're gonna put sanctions on you because this is like ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like so that is just it's crazy how recent that was.
Yeah.
And now I think South Africa is also having troubles now with like
Yes.
there's like some conflict there. I don't know the full scope of that, but
Yeah, but it's a very tense, racially tense region,
mhm.
and these wars absolutely did not help that. But yeah, that's just we wanted to mention that because it was the European on European violence. Now it's kind of European removed because the Boers got to South Africa from the Netherlands quite a while ago, but it
Mhm.
is the only war that took place that wasn't between like Europe and an African like colony.
Mhm.
So important to mention. But if we don't have anything else on that, we can hop over to Ethiopia.
All right. Yeah. Ethiopia. So Ethiopia was one of the sole powers that was and the sole power to independently fight off the Europeans because Liberia at least had American protection, but Ethiopia was essentially on its own. Um, and so they were able to fight off Italy, and Italy was not able to set up colonies in Ethiopia. Um, yeah, and I don't really fully know the reasons for that, but I don't know. Do you have anything like that you know about why they were able to do it?
It was mainly. Oh, I've heard it often compared to Vietnam, in that all citizens of Ethiopia were effectively in the military, which was kind of the
Mhm.
situation with Vietnam. Not necessarily because the government was forcing them to do that, but because they had a strong nationalist mentality and a strong love of their country. Ethiopia no doubt saw what was happening with their neighbors, like Britain was taking territories right past it, like Egypt and the Sudan
Mhm.
area. So they had that nationalistic spirit that they did not want to be conquered, so that every citizen was basically fighting against the kingdom of Italy. And there were two wars between Italy and Ethiopia. Ethiopia won the first one. It actually lost the second one, but I don't believe that in the aftermath Italy actually took over the territory, because at that point in time the second Italo-Ethiopian War was between 1935 and 1937. So during that point in time, that was leading up to World War II, and there was no way that Italy would have been able to kind of handle Ethiopia and fight in World War II. So at this point in time, Mussolini would have been in charge of Italy, I believe. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So his sights were more likely just not set on Ethiopia in contrast to him just building up Italy as a country, which was his main nationalistic idea, and establishing.
And he wanted to like resurrect the Roman Empire.
Right.
He wanted to like create a new Roman Empire, which is like all the territory around the Mediterranean.
So that second war was most likely not fought for the actual territory of Ethiopia, whereas the first war was absolutely fought for that, and Ethiopia did win that war. But the second Italo-Ethiopian War was most likely not fought for territory reasons, but it was, again, probably just a move from Italy just becoming an Axis power, trying to improve national spirit, stuff like that. So Ethiopia still remains one of the only countries to not be taken over by a European power. The first European War, I wonder what that was all those years ago.
Oh man. First, there's like, that's hard to say. I mean, just like the first, I think in any...
You know who we should ask?
Who?
Queen Elizabeth II. She was there.
She would probably know, yeah.
She was like, I was 50. But...
Yeah, it was probably a war between humans and Neanderthals.
Yeah, honestly.
Even, because that's where the Neanderthals used to live in Europe.
Yeah, Germany, around there.
Yeah.
But, so definitely a standout country during the Scramble for Africa. And honestly, that's what I know Ethiopia for. I don't know if that's a common thing with other people, but I know Ethiopia only for being able to fend off Italy during the Scramble for Africa. That's the number one thing that comes to mind when I hear Ethiopia. I don't know much. I'm just obviously not educated in other Ethiopian history or current day Ethiopian culture or government, but
I also thought that Ethiopia is like where like humans were supposed to have like originated.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Like before humans spread out across the world, they started in Ethiopia.
So there you go. Mr. Africa Wide.
Yes, this is Mr. Cecil Rhodes. It's a political cartoon. I would say you've probably seen it before because it's kind of overused in history classes, I would say. History classes love to use the Rhodes Colossus. So if you're taking an AP exam, right, this is funny because my teachers will say this sometimes. They'll say like we'll go over like commonly used pictures on the AP exam and be like, so what does this picture represent? Like, you know what I mean? Yeah. So yeah, this is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was like a British developer in South Africa. They tried to make a colony like South Africa, but larger, that would be called Rhodesia, based on him, Cecil Rhodes. And I forget the story exactly, but it's kind of interesting in that he was like, he wasn't with the British government. He was more with like a company. So he was like running a company that was going to like mine gold in South Africa, and like get rich on the spoils. And so he was sort of enabled by the British government, which is how the British government tends to do things. I mean, like a lot of the colonization efforts, if you think of the companies, I forget, like there's the East India Company, there's like the West Indies Company, right? Like all these different British companies that were involved in like colonizing different regions of the world, which is sort of interesting because like India, before it was controlled by the British government, was just controlled by a British company. So it was just a British company was like, we own India now. And then like there was a huge rebellion and the company on its own couldn't handle it. So then Britain's like, okay, we'll step in. And that is sort of like a strange like thing because you typically think of countries acting as a cohesive unit when it comes to territory outside of the country. You know what I mean? But I mean, this happened in American history too. In like Central America, there were Americans called filibusters, where they would go down to some Central American nation and try to overthrow it with a military coup so that they could sign a treaty with the US to become a US like protectorate. I don't think any of them actually, some of them succeeded, but like I don't, to certain degrees. They didn't really ever succeed in creating like a new American state. But this is how they got the Panama Canal. Colombia used to be Colombia and Panama, like the territory of the nation Colombia used to include Panama. But then, you know, they had a filibuster guy come in, lead a revolution in Panama to break away from Colombia, and then immediately sign a treaty with the US government to say, you can have the canal zoned. So it's sort of interesting how in a lot of these colonization like efforts, you have individuals acting on behalf of their countries, but like separately from them. So yeah.
Yeah. That's a pretty good overview of that. So we can go on to the decolonization of Africa. Again, it's jarring how recent this was. I'm gonna read off the dates of when some of these when some of these African countries became free from European control, and they're, you know, pretty like relatively recent, like through the scope of history.
Mm-hmm.
But we've picked out a couple examples from the decolonization era that stand out, and a couple themes that we wanted to talk about that are important to understand this this era of African history. So we start with just in general Pan-Africanism. This is basically the idea that all African countries band together and work as one unit. This is something that has been attempted in other countries, such as the number of treaties between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, who have North American agreements. The European Union is probably the most famous of the idea that countries of a continent should come together. Asia doesn't really have one. All those guys hate each other.
Yeah,
but
Asia's too big.
Asia is too big, man. I'm sure Australia is doing quite fine, though.
Oh yeah, Australia probably has the most successful continental unification movement in that the entire continent is controlled by a single country. So, yeah, there you go.
But Pan-Africanism is something that is still in development. There was a lot of buzz about it back in 2018, 2019-ish.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, COVID just rocked Africa so hard that it has kind of been on the back burner for a bit. But even during the decolonization era, what occurred when World War One was happening was these countries would meet up. Representatives from each country, like self-determined representatives from each country, would meet with each other at these quote unquote like continental meetings to kind of discuss how they could free their countries from European control. Um,
Mhm.
and a lot of future leaders of African countries were at these meetings, rulers of like Kenya and Nigeria and Ghana were at these meetings. They were called the Pan-African Congress, and by 1945 they were on the fifth Pan-African Congress, which demanded the absolute end of colonialism. Um, and at this meeting, there were some of the delegates included future presidents of Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi, as well as some other national activists. So big figures in African government were at these meetings. And Pan-Africanism was a really strong tool against colonialism because, again, when a group is being oppressed, it, like, freedom isn't just going to be freely given by the oppressor, hence the Martin Luther King quote. It has to be demanded by the oppressed. And it was unlikely that a single country would be able to, you know, kind of voice its opinion for its independence. There's only one country on this list that I think actually achieved that, and that was Egypt. But banding together as a continent is a very strong tool against colonization
Mhm.
from an outside continent.
I
Obviously,
mean, yeah, if you think about it, this is kind of like the anti-Berlin Conference,
right.
these series of conferences, because whereas the Berlin Conference was Europe banding together for a common goal, this is Africa banding together for a common goal. So,
Right.
yeah.
Um, and it could be a very, very strong tool today. We're going to talk about the legacy of all of this and what's going on today in relation to trade in Africa and international relations. And if Africa is able to create a system similar to the European Union, in that, excuse me, in that all, or at least some African countries are able to like join together and form a union, that would be, I would say, in Africa's best interest.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's all I have on this.
Yeah.
So we go on to South Africa. Like I said, South Africa would be the first country besides Liberia to get its independence, and this was through the South Africa Act of 1909, which we have up there. Um, this was Britain consolidating. I believe it was. Yeah, we have that map over there. There was like four territories into simply one nation, and then that nation um, was granted effective independence. Um, I don't know specifically why Britain granted this area independence, but what ended up happening and what I think might have played into it was that they actually established a separate government in South Africa to preside over these four nations. So Britain might not have intended for it to be independence for the nation, but that is pretty much what happened because when they formed this, I believe it was just called like the Union of South Africa. Yeah, the Union of
Hmm.
South Africa was designed after the British government. A Governor General of South Africa was appointed to represent the British monarch. So all of that kind of stuff, in which Britain most likely anticipated that it would just kind of help Britain to run the country, but it ended up making the country self-sustaining, which is really what any country that has another country as its territory, the imperializing territory or country definitely does not want that in their territory. And that actually plays perfectly into the Rwandan genocide, which we'll get into a bit later. But the act of creating a separate government of South Africa does technically make that its own nation to some degree. And I'm not sure when South Africa would declare independence or any of that, but its date of quote-unquote independence is around this time period. Specifically, it's listed as May 31st of 1910, so a year after this was instated. And perhaps that just came from the government itself declaring independence from Britain.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. It's sort of similar to Canada or Australia or New Zealand,
Right.
in that just a lot of the former British colonies became like British allies, like closely connected. Like it's sort of like after the American Revolution occurred, Britain didn't want that to repeat. So what they did is they sort of slowly granted the other colonies independence.
Right.
In a way that would still be favorable for them. Yeah.
But yeah, it came first besides Liberia. But then we can go into what came second, or third if you include Liberia, which is Egypt. And like I said, Egypt is probably one of the only countries, if not the only country, to achieve its independence solely from the citizens of its country through revolution. There are some wars that we'll talk about, but those wars were organized with both other countries of Africa, and they all fought a common enemy, which was Portugal. Egypt got its independence solely alone through revolution. It was through violent revolution, which lasted from 1919 until 1922. There, on the non-violent side of the revolution, there were incredible amounts of strikes to the degree in which normal life was brought to a complete halt because workers simply were not working, farmers weren't farming. Everyone was basically revolting against Britain, who was the controlling power of Egypt. And the violent side of it were attacks on British strongholds around the country. So it's kind of similar to Shays' Rebellion of America, in which it was mainly workers that were organizing this revolution, but the entire country was brought to a halt. And eventually in 1922, a British delegate was sent out to assess the situation and basically determine if it was still profitable to hold on to Egypt. And this guy comes back with a resounding no. And so Britain lets Egypt go.
So that's really interesting, though, because the Suez Canal, that is high stakes.
Yes.
Because Britain also had interests in China, and to get anything from China to Britain, or to Europe, you want control of the Suez Canal. And so that's interesting. I wonder if, because South Africa is not actually, it's not that strategic. It's kind of out of the way of everything, if you think about it. But the Suez Canal, and therefore Egypt, is very important. So what I wonder is, what did the independence of Egypt, was it conditional on we get to keep the thin strip of land around the Suez Canal, but then you get to be independent otherwise. Sort of like a canal zone situation that we had in Panama, where like from like 1912 until 1977 or 79, where Panama was an independent country except for the canal zone, until Jimmy Carter gave up the canal. So yeah, I wonder if they had a similar situation over there.
I'm not saying that that's the case.
Interesting.
But it seems like it was also a revolution against British occupation of Sudan as well. But Sudan would not get its independence until around the 50s, 1956.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was actually through another revolution by Egypt. So even though Egypt had its independence, it was like, hey, get our boy Sudan out of there too. That's the homie.
Interesting.
So that's what happened there. But Egypt, very, very strong country. It takes an incredibly strong people, an incredibly strong determination to bring your country to a halt, because that means that you're not getting food, you're not getting paid, and all that stuff. Like when normal life is brought to a halt, like people can say that COVID brought normal life to a halt, but you still got paid for your job, and you were still like able to get food on your table for the most part. It might have been harder to do those things, and some people did lose their jobs and stuff like that, but normal life, like quote unquote, was not completely shut down. It was altered, but it wasn't shut down. This was the case in Egypt. It was shut down. So it takes a lot of strength for a nation to do that. And that's in 3 years, Britain was out of the area entirely. But we can go on to the wars against Portugal. These were the wars of Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and God damn it, what was it, Uganda? I don't know. I thought I could memorize them. I could not. Let's see.
Sure.
Yes, I've failed. Where are you? No, it's Angola. Sorry. Of course it's Angola. It's against Portugal. Angola as well, with those other two countries against Portugal. These are classified as 3 separate wars. There's the Guinea-Bissauan War of Independence, there's the Angolan War of Independence, and I'm pretty sure there's a Mozambican War of Independence. But they all happened in incredibly quick succession, and they all ended in the same year. So the theme of Pan-Africanism is very, very apparent here, because that is no coincidence that all 3 of these countries revolted at the same time, and the wars all ended in the same year. Now, Portugal is insane. Let's throw that out there. Portugal is insane because these wars went on for like 10 years.
Wow.
Mozambican War lasted for almost exactly 10 years. Guinea-Bissauan War lasted for 11 years. And the Angolan War of Independence lasted for, doing some quick math, 13 years. So it's also no coincidence that these wars all started around the same time. That was the very early 60s. All of these wars ended in 1974 or 1975, and all 3 of these countries gained independence in 1975 officially. So, there weren't many wars in Africa actually for decolonization. So these are pretty standout, and it's interesting that they are all against the same power, which most likely says something to how badly Portugal wanted to hang on to these territories, especially if you're willing to fight 3 wars at once for a period of at the longest 13 years. But at one point in time, it was fighting 3 wars at once, and that period of time lasted for 10 years, which is an incredible feat, and it's an incredible amount of money to throw down. But in the end, it ended with all 3 of these countries gaining their independence from Portugal. Again, I would highly recommend doing more research into this if you're interested in it. But just brief overview: these 3 countries were able to win their independence against Portugal. That's pretty unique for the decolonization era. But that's all I have on that. So we go over to the legacy of the Scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference. I would say the most blatant one is the territory lines. Those territory lines are very similar to the territory lines that were decided through the Scramble for Africa. As well as there's been a lot of impact on the culture, and we can look at that on the next slide, actually, with languages. Just a chart of the main business languages in Africa, and you can see. You can pretty much tell who colonized who, with the exception of of northeastern Africa, Libya, Egypt, Sudan. And Eritrea was colonized by Italy because they were also used in the first and second Italian wars against Ethiopia.
But yeah, it is really interesting. Basically, the northern third of Africa is mostly Muslim countries, and so they speak Arabic,
right.
For the most part. But otherwise, you can tell, all the gray countries here and the tan countries too are sort of English colonies where English is now spoken. The red countries here are the 3 Portuguese colonies. All those blue countries, these are the French colonies that now speak French. So it's really interesting that today most of Africa speaks either English or French, depending on where you are, or Arabic. And so English and French, those were the 2 main powers that had control over land here. And so it's just interesting how neatly it aligns, just because, and again, this is the business language. And so during the time of the colonies, most business was conducted in the language of the colonizing country. So it's just interesting how that has stuck around today.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that's just a very quick and easy way to see the lasting impact of these things. And again, it's also very important to remember that this did not happen very long ago. All of those wars that we talked about on the previous slide all ended in 1975. Most members of Gen X were already born. And, through the scope of history, that's no time at all.
Yeah.
But in any case, the last, here, let's see what the last date of the last decolonization was. That would be Namibia, which I think used to be part of maybe South Africa.
Yeah, let's see. Namibia. Which country colonized? So Namibia was
England,
a
right?
German colony.
Oh, German.
Yeah, German Empire. But so here's the thing. After World War I, most of the German colonies became either French or British.
Right.
So this is according to the 1913 map. So Namibia was probably German and then English.
Right.
That's why that's there. Whereas let's look at another one. I think Cameroon was initially German, but then French.
And Rwanda was originally, it must have been originally German, but then the control over the area was delegated to another power, and we'll get to that
Mhm.
on the next slide with the Rwanda genocide.
Yeah. And it looks like Tanzania too was German and then became English.
Right.
So,
So Namibia won its or received its independence from England in 1990. So
wow, that is pretty recent.
yeah, 1990. Not very long ago.
Hmm.
Don't have many memories from then,
1990.
but
Many, not many. Oh,
I
so
mean,
yes, some.
I can't forget the 90s, man. But yeah.
Yes.
In any case, we can, like I said, we can go on over to the Rwandan genocide. So Rwanda is a very, very small country. It's where,
Mhm.
like Wakanda is in the Marvel universe. It is very close to the Belgian Congo and Tanzania. It was originally colonized by Germany, but like you said, Germany lost control of its African territories, so the powers were delegated to other people. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, did Rwanda get the short stick. Just a
Mm.
horrible, horrible hand of cards. Because power over Rwanda was not delegated to England, was not delegated to, hell, I would have even taken Portugal. It was delegated to Belgium.
Ah.
Oh dear lord. So, Belgium, being as conniving as ever. I really did not before we started studying this. Belgium was not
Mhm.
like the villain that it is now in my mind. You know,
Yeah.
because the Rwanda
The
genocide
waffle
is
people.
they were just the waffle guys. It's always the guys
Yeah.
you don't suspect. You know,
Well,
but
it is interesting with the Rwandan genocide because it occurred after decolonization, right?
yes, it did.
Um, so that's like I bet Belgium. I think they messed things up because I read a book on it like before, like 2 years ago. It was my summer reading for AP World History,
Right.
and I think I remember it was like Belgium, in order to keep control, like intentionally pitted two
That's
groups of people
exactly what
against each other.
happened. Like I was saying earlier, the last thing that a country that's dominant over a territory wants that territory to become is self sufficient. And
Hmm.
Belgium was able to exploit um, different ethnic groups against each other. There are two main ethnic groups in Rwanda: the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Tutsis were by far the minority. Only about I want to say like 12% of the country. I think it
Hmm.
was like a 90-10 split or maybe an 80-20 split between the Hutus and the Tutsis, respectively. But because of this, what happened was at first the Belgians prioritized the Hutus over the Tutsis and tried to give them preferential treatment, but that didn't really work well because they were the majority. So they changed it to give Tutsis the preferential treatment because they were a minority. So by prioritizing a minority, they were able to incite anger in the majority. So the focus was shifted off of, oh, let's free our country from Belgian control. It was, why are these guys getting preferential treatment over us? We need to fight for that preferential treatment instead of against the person giving that treatment at all.
Hmm.
It's a very slippery, conniving move coming out from Belgium. But it worked exactly as Belgium wanted it to because these ethnic groups were too busy pitted against each other that they didn't focus on Belgium. And eventually Belgium lost control of the area, but these groups still hated each other because of that. the bitterness was still there. So a legacy of Belgium giving the Tutsis preferential treatment was that they actually gave them positions in the government of Rwanda, which they must have constructed after Germany left the area. So they gave the Tutsis high-ranking positions in the government. You have to remember that they only made up like maybe 12-15% of the country, but they accounted for something like 70% of all government jobs. So incredibly disproportionate. So this led to attacks on the government, and the president of Rwanda, who I believe was a Tutsi, was actually assassinated via like rocket launcher to his helicopter. In a very dramatic
Actually, I think that might have been I think
it was the other way.
Might have been that the president might have been Hutu, because I think that was the like spark for the Rwandan genocide to occur, was that the Hutus were upset about that, and it was, I forget exactly. I remember that the assassination of the president was like the spark of violence.
Let's see.
Yeah.
So this guy, I cannot say his name. Yes, you're correct. He was a Hutu. So yeah, I got it flipped. And that led to Hutu aggression against the Tutsis. And it was, this all occurred in 1994. It was a slaughter here at the and it was a brutal slaughter at that, because the main method of execution was not through use of firearms, but rather of machetes, because that was the most common weapon in Rwanda. So
it was just like it was like bad, because also there was an issue where the UN like was ineffective. Like I think before, like as violence was brewing, the UN had like a delegate or something, like they had a representative there, and a small like contingent, like 200 soldiers or something for a whole country, like peacekeepers. And so the like representative guy who was there in Rwanda, after he like analyzed the situation, he was like, we're gonna need a lot more peacekeeping forces here. Like this is not gonna end well. But the UN just kept not doing anything. They're just like, no. And so it's often recognized as a failure of the UN. And it's interesting because I think even today the UN says it wasn't the Rwandan genocide. They say it was like acts of genocide occurred. Like they didn't say, like officially it wasn't that it was a genocide. It was that acts of genocide occurred, which is like, okay, UN, that's the same thing. You're just trying to shift, like you're just trying to make it not seem that bad that you dropped the ball. Which is kind of like,
that is exactly
like what does that mean?
Yeah, honestly,
like that's really like, what does that mean? It's not genocide. It's acts of like what? Like, that doesn't mean anything, UN.
I did not commit homicide. I committed acts of homicide.
Yeah, like exactly. It's completely like,
I didn't stab him to death. I stabbed him and he happened to die.
Exactly.
Blood
like
loss.
it's exactly. It's just,
yeah, it's ridiculous.
The UN
they sent like 8 dudes. It was like not enough.
Barely anyone.
And it's like this was 1994. You know, like current day things were happening. Like there was like current day technology. Like Joe Biden was already in the Senate at this point in time. Like it was 1994.
Yeah, I mean, this is Bill Clinton was president.
Exactly, 1994 is arguably the modern era. So we were in the modern era, and all we could muster up was a very, very small, like I said, 8. That's me being like underbolic, whatever, hypobolic. But it was.
Yeah.
I think realistically we sent maximum maybe 300 people, which is not
Hmm.
enough because the total death toll is around 1 million. Um,
Yeah. Well,
around
it's a whole country. Like, how are you going to send a
exactly,
few hundred people to keep the peace in an entire country?
exactly.
Like, not going to work. Even
The,
if it's a small country. Like,
yeah, the majority of those deaths were the Tutsi. They counted for anywhere
mhm.
between 500,000 to 800. Yeah, 500,000 to 800,000 of those deaths. They were the main targets of the genocide. Um, but this, I mean, like it was a horrific point in time, and just again, like just such a failure of the UN. Um,
Mm.
and it led to so many other horrific things happening because everything that happened in Rwanda allowed for another war to happen. This wasn't a war, but allowed for a war to occur after the genocide in 1996, which was which was Rwanda versus the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is where a lot of Hutus that were exiled were residing, or Hutus that had fled the country were residing, because the president that took power after the genocide, or like halfway through the genocide, was a Tutsi, and I think he is still the president, by the name of Paul Kagame. Um,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's who the book was about that I read.
yeah,
So,
and he was very, very bitter about this, which is probably why he launched an invasion into the Congo, which again killed hundreds of thousands of people, and human rights violations were run rampant in situations like that, um, and just it gave way to so much strife that could have been avoided if the UN had responded to it as
mm,
needed. Um, but it does trace its origins back to colonization, because originally Germany fails, Belgium takes over. What a crap deal, I gotta say.
mm,
Like, unluck of the draw, but
yeah.
it,
Belgium. I mean, crazy.
evil. Did not
Like,
expect them to be
yeah.
the Lex Luthor of today's
Mm,
podcast, but
yeah, exactly.
that is a very, very brief overview of the Rwanda genocide. Again, a lot of niches
Hmm.
that go into there.
Yeah, here, wait.
Yeah.
I forget the title of the book. I want to get the book just in case anyone wants to read it. Um, oh, yeah, it's called A Thousand Hills
Mm.
by Kinzer. Stephen Kinzer. That's the book that we read for um, AP World History. So yeah, if you are interested in that subject,
Yeah.
that's what I read.
But that takes us to our last slide for our final thoughts. Just where it is today in the more modern era, because I still think
Mhm.
1994 is the modern era. Like, the internet wasn't as good, like social media wasn't as good, but we still had the internet and all of that other stuff. But these are two maps, um, and these are a little dated. It should be taken
Mhm.
into consideration. These were both made about 4 years ago, so I'm not sure how this would have changed. But this was gathered based on data from the CIA in their public domain information. But on the left is an import map of Africa, and on the right is an export map of Africa. All of the flags shown in each individual country is its top import partner or its top export partner, depending on the map. And there's one very, very big thing that we see here, and that is China and Chinese influence. It has been argued that we are currently in the second scramble for Africa today, led almost primarily by China. Mainly
almost exclusively, I would say.
yeah,
Right?
the only
Like,
other factor would be Russia to some degree, but pretty much almost exclusively, yeah, by China. They are attempting to do what they have done with their Asian neighbors, which is kind of force them into debt so that they can force them to obey, China's will. What the,
and so, like, an example of that would be,
yeah.
like, Chinese developers could come to some African country and say, like, we will help you build like a harbor, like a port city, because that will, a port will help develop your economy. And so the African countries will say, yeah, let's do it. And so then the Chinese developers will say, like, well, you don't have the money, so we will loan you the money. But the developers don't actually expect the countries to pay them back, even though it's in the contracts. So they intentionally deal out loans that they know they're not going to get a return on, because the return they're going to get is, if you don't pay the loan, well, then it goes into repossession. So now the Chinese developers own the harbor rather than the city or the country, right? And so, as you can imagine, that means that China has ownership over a lot of infrastructure in some of these countries. And they're doing this like around the world, I would say, but it's more prevalent in Africa because the African countries are less likely to be able to repay the debts. And so in that way, China is able to like further their political influence in those countries and kind of take them over, but like not really, like without the use of military forces, So
Yeah. But yeah, so China is trying to achieve the same exact thing in Africa. Many of these nations are impoverished, which is another legacy of imperialism, but China is taking advantage of that. So only time will tell what the outcome of that is. If the UN will throw sanctions on China for this, if the African powers will reject the notion of Chinese influence and instead turn to Pan-Africanism, or if Africa will fall victim to a second scramble for Africa again.
Yeah, it will be interesting because, like, technically, nothing that China's doing is illegal.
Yes.
In this situation.
Yeah.
Because the African countries chose to take on the loans, but it's like, it's definitely like a strange scenario, because usually when you give a loan, you want to get paid back. So
yeah,
it's a strange thing, and the U.S. isn't really doing that, and so that sort of is an interesting issue, because it's like the U.S. shouldn't be doing that because that's not really the most upstanding business practices. But at the same time, it's like it's not really a scramble if it's just one country. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it'll be interesting to see how Chinese influence in Africa affects international trade and foreign relations and things like that.
Yeah. But I think that brings us to final thoughts.
All right. Final thoughts. So yeah, this was a history about Africa. Lots more history than we could cover.
Oh, yeah.
Again, second largest continent in the world. So this was necessarily very general. But if you want to do more, if you're interested in any of these topics that we went over, then you can look into them further. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. It's fascinating that like you said, the second largest continent on the planet can be conquered effectively in a span of, 30 years? And that power can be maintained for quite some time. It took a world war for the majority of the countries to band together with Pan-Africanism and start thinking about independence. And it took the majority of those countries a second world war to gain that independence. And for some of them, it took them to have their own revolutionary war against Portugal, because I think those were the only like revolutionary wars that took place. But it's very strange, and there's so much minutia to it that it really does demand like further investigation, which is why again we're recommending you do that further investigation if you're interested. But there's a lot there, and pretty much all of it dictates why Africa is the way it is today. In regards to GDP, in regards to the languages they speak, in regards to the cultures, past events like apartheid or the Rwandan genocide, and really the only thing that hasn't been determined by this is where they're going to move to in the future. And we will be watching that with a very close eye.
So with that being said, I would like to thank Sebastian for being my co-host as always. And I would like to thank everyone for watching today. Hope you enjoyed the episode and got some good information. So yeah, that's about it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.